The Bad Man Mr. Gum by Andy Stanton. Chapter 1. The Garden of Mr. Gum. Mr. Gum was a fierce old man with a red beard and two bloodshot eyes that stared out at you like an octopus curled up in a bad cave. He was a complete horror who hated children, animals, fun, and corn on the cob. What he liked was snoozing in bed all day, being lonely and scowling at things. He slept and scowled and picked his nose and ate it. Most of the townsfolk of Lamonic Bibber avoided him, and the children were terrified of him. Their mouths would say, "Go to bed when I tell you to, or Mr. Gum will come and shout at your toys and leave slime on your books." That usually did the trick. Mr. Gum lived in a great big house in the middle of town. Actually, it wasn't that great, because he had turned it into a disgusting pigsty. The rooms were filled with junk and pizza boxes. Empty milk bottles lay around like wounded soldiers in war against milk. And there were old newspapers from years and years ago with headlines like "Vikings invade Britain" and "World's first newspaper invented today." Insects lived in the kitchen cupboards, not just small insects, but great big ones with faces and names and jobs. Mr. Gum's bedroom was absolutely grimsters. The wardrobe contained so much mould and old cheese that there was hardly any room for moth-eaten clothes, and the bed was never made. I don't mean that the duvet was never put back on the bed. I mean the bed had never ever been made. Mr. Gum hadn't gone to the bother of assembling it. He had just chucked all his bits of wood on the floor and dumped a mattress on top. There was broken glass in the windows, and the ancient carpet was the colour of unhappiness and smelt like a toilet. Anyway, I could be here all day long going on about Mr. Gum's house, but I think you've got the idea. Mr. Gum was an absolute laser who couldn't be bothered with niceness and tidying and brushing his teeth, or anyone else's teeth for that matter. But, and as you can see, it's a big but, he always extremely careful to keep his garden tidy. In fact, Mr. Gum, his garden is so tidy that it was the prettiest, greenest, floweriest, gardeniest garden in the whole of Lamonic Bibber. Here's how amazing it was. Think of a number between 1 and 10. Multiply that number by 5. Add on 350. Take away 11. Throw all those numbers away. Now think of an amazing garden. Whatever number you started with, you should now be thinking of an amazing garden, and that's how amazing Mr. Gum's garden was. In spring, it was bursting with crocuses and daffodils. In summer, there were roses, sunflowers, and those little blue ones. What are they called again? You know, those blue ones, they look a bit like dinosaurs. Anyway, there were tons of them. In autumn, the leaves from the big oak tree covered the lawn, turning it gold like a gigantic leafy robot. In winter, it was winter. No one in town could understand how Mr. Gum's garden could be so pretty, greeny, flowery, and gardeny when his house was such a filthy tip. "Maybe he just likes gardening," said Jonathan Ripples, the fattest man in town. "Perhaps he's trying to win a garden contest," said a little girl called Peter. "I reckon he just quite likes gardening," said Martin Laundrette, who ran the laundrette. "Oi, that was my idea," said Jonathan Ripples. "No, it wasn't," said Martin Laundrette. "You can't prove it, fatso." In fact, they were all wrong. The real reason was this. Mr. Gum had to keep the garden tidy, because otherwise an angry fairy would appear in his bathtub and start whacking him with a frying pan. You see, there is always a simple explanation for things. Mr. Gum hated the fairy, but he couldn't work out how to get rid of it, so his only choice was to do the gardening, or it was pan wax. And so life went on in the peaceful town of Lamonic Bibber. Everyone got on with their business, and Mr. Gum snoozed the days away in his dirty house and did lots of gardening. He didn't want to, and nothing much ever happened, and the sun went down over the mountains. Sorry, I nearly forgot. Something did happen, once. That's what this story's about. I do apologise. Right, what was it? Of course. How would I be so stupid? It was that massive whopper of a dog. How on earth could I forget a whopper of a dog like him? How on earth could I forget him? Right then, one day, and a massive whopper of a dog. Actually, I think we'd better have a new chapter. Sorry about all this, everyone. Chapter 2. A massive whopper of a dog. One day, a massive whopper of a dog came to live on the outskirts of town. Where did he come from? Nobody knows. What strange things had he seen? Nobody knows. What was his name? Everybody knows. It was Jake, the dog. He was furry, wobbler, and friendly as toast. He soon made himself very popular. He would often come into town to play with the children and give them rides on his enormous broad back. No matter how many children wanted to laugh on him, he never grew tired. He was just that sort of dog. If he had been a person, he probably would have been a king, or at least a very fast racing car driver with a cool helmet. Or perhaps he would have been a gardener, because Jake the dog loved nothing more than playing in gardens. He enjoyed rolling his big doggy body around on springy green lawn to see what it felt like. Generally, it felt like the lawn, and chomping up the flowers in his big doggy mouth to see what they tasted like. Generally, they tasted like flowers. He looked so happy that nobody really minded his messy visits. In fact, a rumour began that if Jake the dog visited your garden, it meant you were in for some good luck, and if he left a little gift on the lawn, you were in for double good luck, and maybe even a telegram from the Queen. So the townsfolk started to leave pies and bones out on their lawns, hoping to tempt Jake into their gardens. Sometimes it worked and sometimes not. Mostly, he played where he liked and when he liked. He was a free spirit. Like Robin Hood or the Man on the Moon or something, I don't know. He was just a dog, after all. All summer long, Jake played, and everything was fine until the fateful day he discovered a garden he'd never been in before. It was the prettiest, greeniest, floweriest, gardeniest garden in the whole of Lamonic Bibber. On that fateful day, Mr. Gunn was snoozing away in his unmade bed. I told you he was a laser, and that's what lasers do. He was dreaming his favourite dream, the one where he was a giant terrorising the townfolk. His enormous bloodshot eyes flashed evilly like flying saucers high up in the clouds as he snatched the roofs of houses to steal the toys from the children's bedrooms. Nobody could stop him. He was the biggest and the best. He was. Whack! For a moment, Mr. Gum did not know what was happening. Where were those tiny houses? Where were the frightened people? Where are the whack? Oh! Yelled Mr. Gum, rubbing his head and looking around in terror. Oh no! He rasped. The angry fairy was hovering over him, frying pan ready. Sort out your garden, you lazy snorer! Yelled the fairy, and down came the frying pan. Mr. Gum was too fast this time and shot out of bed like a guilty onion. Pfft! Went the frying pan as it hit the bedcovers, sending up a little cloud of dust and ants. Mr. Gum legged it out of the bedroom and went hurtling down the stairs. He stepped on an old slice of pizza lying in the hall and skidded into the kitchen, riding it like cheese and tomato surfboard. He could hear the fairy right behind him, shrieking with fury. I ain't done nothing wrong. I kept the flipping garden tidy, shouted Mr. Gum as he flung open the back door and ran outside. He started to say something else, but when he saw the garden, the words got stuck in his throat. They tasted horrible. The garden was not tidy. The garden was a total wreck. The lawn was tufted up and torn. The flower beds were trampled and chewed. Rose petals and sunflower heads lay scattered all over the place like rose petals and sunflower heads. There was nothing lying under the oak tree that Mr. Gum did not even want to think about. And in the centre of the wreckage lay the most monstrous dog Mr. Gum had ever seen. It was Jake, of course. The beast was rolling around him for his own fun, his golden brown fur matted with grass, his happy eyes squinting into the sunshine. Before Mr. Gum's disbelieving eyes, 9 moles popped out of their holes and joined the party. The 2 smallest ones began bouncing up and down on Jake's furry belly and doing somersaults. The rest of them chased each other in circles or had races. Whack! The pan came down on Mr. Gum's head, faster than Superman. Slap! The pan whipped him on the bottom. Boing! A fat one to the belly. Mr. Gum doubled up in pain and tripled up in fear as the fairy raged. It ain't my fault, he yelled. I ain't never seen that dog before. I don't care whose fault it is. If you splurk, job to wallop, do the gardening, roink, you stupid trouser face. Mr. Gum flung himself down on the lawn and lay there whimpering, his eyes shut tight in unbraveness. Jake, on the other hand, was having a brilliant time, but just then a cloud shaped a bit like a bone drifted by. With a hungry bark, Jake ran off to chase it. Mr. Gum watched as the dog bounced over the fence and disappeared off to who knows where. The moles raced back to their moleholes at the speed of moles. As suddenly as it had begun, the terror was over. Mr. Gum spent all afternoon repairing the damage. The fairy watched over him, scowling and brandishing their frying pan dangerously to hurry him on. Eventually, the garden was back to normal, and with one last whack for good measure, the fairy flew back to the bathtub and vanished. Mr. Gum breathed a sigh of relief and went inside to find he'd missed his favourite show, Bag of Sticks, which was a picture of a bag of sticks for half an hour. Mr. Gum was the only person in the country who ever watched Bag of Sticks. Everyone else turned over to watch Fun Time with Crispy. That dog ought to be given a meddling medal. He's such a meddler, muttered Mr. Gum. But it wasn't the last of Jake. It was the beginning. Jake's big doggy brain could not stop thinking about that amazing garden, and the very next day he returned, with much the same result as before, and the day after that, and the day after that, but not the day after that, because it was Wednesday, and everyone knows that dogs have the day off on Wednesdays, but on Thursday you should have seen him. He was back in his Venians every day apart from Wednesday. It was the same story. That massive whopper of a dog would come bouncing over the fence and start romping around like an uncontrollable doctor, sometimes leaving his little gifts, as was only natural. Mr. Gum would run out into the garden shaking a fist on the end of a stick to frighten him off, but he could never catch him. Jake would just bark like a cheeky schoolboy doing an impression of a dog barking. Then he'd bounce over the spiky fence and disappear off to who knows where. 3 weeks later, Mr. Gum was covered in frying pan-shaped bruises, and he had missed 10 episodes of Bags of Sticks. It was time for action. Nasty action. It's time for action, said Mr. Gum to nobody in particular. Nasty action. Nobody in particular shrugged his shoulders and wandered off to eat his dinner. Mr. Gum went to the shed and got out his thinking cap. He put it on his knee. It was a kneecap, and started thinking about how to get rid of that dog. Chapter 3. Mr. Gum lays the plans like the horror he is. The next morning, Mr. Gum was in the butcher shop. The butcher was a scrawny old man called Billy William III, and no one knew what the third bit meant. I reckon he was in prison when he was younger, and his number was 3, said Jonathan Ripples, the fattest man in town. Maybe it's because he's the third nastiest person in town, said the little girl called Peter. Tell you what I think, said Martin Laundrette, who ran the laundrette. When he was a young man, he was probably in prison, and, "Hey," said Jonathan Ripples, "stop stealing my ideas." "Shut up," said Martin Laundrette. "Why don't you go on a diet?" Of course, Billy William III had his own theory. "It's 'cause I'm actually royalty," he would tell anyone foolish enough to listen. "I'm third in line for the throne of England, after them other geezers." He always pronounced England in that way. Other words he said funny were hospital, fountain, and funny. Nobody ever believed Billy William and the third story about him being royalty, except for Billy William himself, and even he didn't believe it most of the time. But he enjoyed lying. It made him laugh. Not a nice laugh you and I would do, but a sneaky old laugh on the inside where nobody else could see. Anyway, forget it. The important thing is that Mr. Gum had gone to BW3's butcher shop, which was Billy William III's royal meats, to buy the biggest load of meat he could get his angry hands on. He had a plan. "I've got a plan," he told Billy William. "Next time that whopper dog comes on playing in my lawn, well, he better watch out. That's all my plan is. The best." "Are you going to be laying down all that meat and poisoning it, so when the barking fatty eats it, he all goes down dead?" guessed Billy William. "Maybe I am," said Mr. Gum, a little annoyed that the butcher had guessed his plan so quickly. He had been looking forward to explaining it in detail and impressing Billy William with his cleverness and bad heart. "Talking of bad heart," said the butcher. "Here's 3 pounds of it. It's been sitting out in the sun since last Tuesday. That ought to poison him, and no mistake. Mr. Gum, you old slipper." "Why do you leave it sitting out in the sun?" said Mr. Gum, taking the horrible sloppy bag from the disgusting butcher. "I like watching the flies go mad over it," laughed Billy William. "They're funty. You see, that's how he pronounces the word funny. It's the funtiest sight in all of England. I laughed so hard that I nearly had to go to the hospital." "Well, thank you, me old gobbler," said Mr. Gum, handing over some money that Billy William would later discover to be made out of lies and broken promises, and with that he left the shop. Out in the high street, Mr. Gum remembered he hadn't been nasty to anyone in over 10 minutes. He looked round for any children who might be playing, or just walking, or anything. It didn't really matter what they were doing. Even reading a book would be fine, just some children he could be nasty to. But there were none to be seen, so he went and bought a newspaper. He opened it up to a photo of a 10-year-old boy who just won the World Record Cup reward for secret burping. "This'll do nicely," said Mr. Gum, and he scowled at the photograph all the way home, hardly even looking where he was going. At that point he tripped over a stone, which made him feel like the burper was somehow beating him, but that only made him scowl harder than ever. "So you see, I've won again," he said with a proud smile, which he quickly turned back into a scowl. Back home, Mr. Gum locked all the doors and windows, even the broken ones. Then he sat down to think on the old sailor's chest, which stood in the front hall. It was a beautiful old thing that was made of mahogany, which is a type of wood called mahogany, and it was carved all over with amazing scenes of life at sea with waves and whales and tall ships. Mr. Gum had owned the sailor's chest for over 40 years, but he had never once taken the time to appreciate its beauty. What's more, Mr. Gum had never once thought to open that beautiful chest and see what was inside. Had he done so, it might have been a very different story indeed. It might have been Mr. Gum's chocolatey adventure, because I'll tell you something. That old chest had once belonged to a sailor called Nathaniel Surname, the hero of the high seas. One Tuesday long ago, he had saved a Spanish village from being destroyed by a terrible pirate called Kevin. As a prize, the village presented Nathaniel with the chest, which was absolutely stuffed full of chocolate. Not just any old chocolate, mind you, but special chocolate made by the dolphins of the region. And it might just be a legend, but some said it was magical chocolate with fantastic powers, and they always whispered when they said it, which is why it is written so small. How the chest ended up in Mr. Gum's house, nobody knows, but there it had stood for over 40 years, uninvolved and unopened. As a result, Mr. Gum had never discovered Nathaniel's sugary treasure, which just goes to prove that angry people always miss out on their rewards. They are so busy sniping and griping that they never see the good things around them. As the famous song says, "You've got to have eyes for the lovely things in life. If you've only got eyes for the horrid and the bad, how you gonna get, I say how you gonna get, I say how you gonna get the chocolate you deserve? Yeah, 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 yes. We've got to have eyes for the amazing joy and stuff. If you've only got eyes for old walnuts filled with spit, how you gonna get, I said how you gonna get, tell me how you gonna get the chocolate you deserve." Repeat chorus with ostrich noises to fade. So it was at that Mr. Gum found himself sitting on a sailor's fortune with what may have been a magic chocolate in terrible ignorance hatching evil. "How do I know these cow hearts are going to be rotten enough?" he asked himself presently. "I'd better try eating one myself. If it kills me, then I'll know it's rotten enough to use on that big woofer." He took out the cow's heart and opened his mouth wide. "This is one of the craftiest things I've ever done," he chuckled, raising the smelly greenish red meat to his lips. "I am a very clever man." Mr. Gum was just about to take a bite when he realized this might not be such a great idea after all. He put the heart back into the bag and thoughtfully scratched his beard. Not the beard that grew on his chin, but a spare one that grew on the wall that he used for scratching it any time. In the end, he decided to soak the rotten hearts in rat poison, just to be sure. "I can't fail," he cackled. "Old Doggett is in for a surprise. He won't like it at all." Chapter 4. Mr. Gum has a cup of tea. Mr. Gum had a cup of tea. Chapter 5. Jammy, Grammy, Lammy, Huppa, Huppa, Berlin, Stereo, Leb, Siepa, Mnemonic, Lestrapec, De Grespin, De Crespin, De Sprespin, De Yespin, De Whoop, De Loop, De Bronco, Merry Christmas, Lenoir. The next morning, Mr. Gum inspected the cowhearts. They had been soaking all night in rat poison, and they were good and proper dangerous to dogs now, and gave off a foul smell even worse than before. Those blibberin' dog'll be smelling this bad smell, and with the animal instincts of animals, he'll refuse to eat 'em, thought the crafty old man. I'd better disguise the smell with something nice. Shabba me whiskers! Mr. Gum looked through his kitchen cupboards, but was there anything nice in there? Course there wasn't. All he could find was rotten turnip, a dried up mushroom, and a sock full of stale crisps. So off he headed into town. He was in a filthy mood, and as he walked along, he muttered to himself. Shabba me whiskers, he muttered. Who'd have thought poisoning that stupid whopper dog could be such hard work? What a bother it all is. There was a little girl playing in the hedge as Mr. Gum walked by, and she heard what he said and grew alarmed. What's old Mr. Gum up to now with talk of poisoning whopper dogs? Said the little girl to herself. What whopper dog can he mean? She ran through a list of all the whopper dogs, and that she knew. It didn't take long, because she only knew one, Jake, that big lovable golden old hound. No, she cried. No, I won't let it happen. I love that dogs. Watch out, 'cause it's true. I loves him, and what's more, the dog saved my life once, and now I'm going to stand by playing in a hedge with all this grizzler flippin' poisons him to death and destruction. No ways. I'll get him. That's what I'll do. Now, this little girl's name was Jammy, Gammy, Lammy, Fupa, Berlin, Stereotype, Leb, Siep, Mnemonica, Lestrapec, De Grespin, De Spespin, De Vespin, De Whoop, De Loop, De Bronco, Merry Christmas, Lenoir. But her friends just called her Polly. You will have to make up your mind now whether or not you are her friend. If you are, then you can call her Polly too. But if you are not, then every time you say the name Polly in the story in your head, you will have to say, Jammy, Gammy, Lammy, Fupa, Berlin, Stereo, Orleb, Seyepa, Mnemonica, Lestrapec, De Grespin, De Crespin, De Spespin, De Vespin, De Whoop, De Loop, De Brunkle, Merry Christmas, Lenoir instead. For instance, she's about to go running down a hill like this. Polly went racing down the hill like a runaway marble. Now, if you're her friend, then don't worry about it. But if you're not her friend, you will have to read it like this. Jammy, Gammy, Lammy, Fupa, Berlin, Stereo, Orleb, Seyepa, Mnemonica, Lestrapec, De Grespin, De Spespin, De Vespin, De Whoop, De Loop, De Bronco, Merry Christmas, Lenoir, went racing down the hill like a runaway marble. Most people in the Mnemonic Bibber chose to be Polly's friend for the sake of time and convenience. Luckily, though, Polly was a girl worth liking. She was 9 years old, with lovely sandy hair, like a cat's daydream, and a smile as happy as the Bank of England, and when she laughed, the sunlight went splashing off her pretty teeth like diamonds in search of adventure. So Polly went racing down the hill like a runaway marble, determined to find Jake the dog, before he fell victim to Mr. Gum's evil scheme. She didn't know how exactly what the old man had in mind, but she knew her big friend was in trouble. She ran past the old curiosity shop and then ran back because she was curious to see what was inside. Then she remembered the danger Jake was in and continued on her way. She ran past a dustbin filled with rubbish, and then another one filled with rubbish, and then another one filled with rubbish, and then another one filled with princesses. There was something unusual about one of those dustbins. She had time to think, but she had to keep on running. She ran past big trees, little trees, tiny trees, and tiny, tiny, tiny little trees, so small they were more like pebbles. In fact, they were pebbles. She ran past a cat's ear, which was there lying on the pavement, and a cat's nose and whiskers, which were lying on the pavement, and a cat's body and tail and legs and eyes and claws, which were lying on the pavement. In fact, it was all just one cat, lying on the pavement. She ran like the wind and then got tired and just walked like a breeze, but she soon sped up again because she was determined to save that tremendous dog. It was only after she had been running for about half an hour that she remembered something quite important. She had absolutely no idea where Jake lived, and what's more, she was no longer in Lamonic Bibber. She had come to the woods on the edge of town, and they were big and scary and full of shadows. The ancient trees looked down from on high, stern and forbidding. "We are the trees," they seemed to whisper. "You are not welcome in the place. We are the trees." A cold wind blew, making Polly shiver, and she was certain one of the flowers was snarling at her. "Oh no," she cried, sitting down on one of those massive toadstools you sometimes get in spooky woods. "I don't know where I am. That old Jake's facing the biggest challenge of his doggy life, and I don't know where to find him, and that flower probably gonna eat me." And with that she burst into tears. Just then an old man peered out the window of a secret cottage, half hidden in the bushes behind her. Polly hadn't noticed the cottage, and I'm sure you wouldn't have either. That's the thing about secret cottages. They're secret. "Well, well, well," said the old man. "What have we here? A little girl in trouble?" And here this chapter ends, leaving you to wonder if the old man was Mr. Gum, or if it was a different old man who was going to be nasty to Polly and laugh at her and stuff. Or maybe he was a good man. Yes, this chapter ends here, with me not telling you that Polly was sitting outside the cottage of Friday O'Leary, a fantastic old fellow who knew the mysteries of time and space and things of that nature, and with me not telling you that he is one of the heroes of this tale. Ha ha! I am keeping that information to myself, and you will have to wait until Chapter 7 to find this out. That is what is known as a suspense. Chapter 6. Mr. Gum lays down his hearts. Meanwhile, Mr. Gum was mumbling and grumbling his way into town. He made his way past Billy William III's Right Royal Meats, and while he was tempted to go in, he knew that it would be a waste of time. He would never find anything nice smelling in Billy William's butcher shop. That was one of the reasons Mr. Gum liked him, because he was a stinker. There was no customers with Billy William at that hour, and Mr. Gum could see him through the dirty window. He was playing a game of butcher's darts, which is exactly the same as normal darts, except that the board is a pig's head, and the darts are old sheep's bones. Billy William had invented it one day when he was drunk. Mr. Gum loved the butcher's darts, but there was no time to pop in and challenge Billy William to a match. He had more important fish to fry, or rather to poison, or rather dog, not fish. He had more important dog to poison. So he continued on and crossed over to Mrs. Lovely's wonderful land of sweets, which was a sweet shop at the other end of the road. As you might guess, Mr. Gum didn't enjoy going in there because it was a wonderland of sweets and goodness, and Mr. Gum was a filthy old devil who hated good things like sweets and birthday parties and kittens dressed as clowns. He would much rather hear a piano being demolished by illegal bulldozers than a Mozart concerto. He didn't even like pop music, not even the Beatles. The only thing he liked about the Beatles was their name, because they sounded like insects, and you could scare people with insects. So he stepped into the sweet shop as cautionally as paper hat in a storm. Immediately the air was full of marvellous scents, the powdery smell of sherbet lemons, mingled with the odours of strawberry bombs and licorice whips. Mr. Gum felt sick. He felt as if he were being attacked by the forces of good. When he was a boy, he had loved eating sweets, but that was before he turned into a bad man. Yet now he seemed to hear the voice of the boy he had once been, calling to him down the years. Where did it go? All the good. Where, oh where? Turn again, you can be good again, I know it. There is still time. Turn again, Mr. Gum, said the voice in his head. He looked down and saw that the voice was not in his head after all, but belonged to a young boy who was standing next to him. Turn again, Mr. Gum, you can be good again, said the boy, offering him a fruit chew. For some strange reason, the boy's honest face frightened Mr. Gum more than anything else in that sweet shop. All this talk of turning again, he snarled, shoving the boy out of the door. I don't likes it, I tell yous. It makes me feel sick. At the moment, Mrs. Lovely came tumbling out of the back room with her kindly eyes and kindly nose and kindly ears. How can noses and ears be kindly? Wondered Mr. Gum. But it was true. Everything about Mrs. Lovely was kindly. She was even kindly to disgracers like Mr. Gum, and he could not bear this. It made him want to break down inside and cry all the bad things away. "Hello, you old witch," he sneered. "Give me some lemon powder." Mrs. Lovely's eyes sparkled. "Yes, it is a beautiful day, Mr. Gum. Yes, indeed," she smiled as she measured out a bag of lemon powder. "I don't know what's so lovely about it, you old menace," snarled Mr. Gum, handing over some potatoes he had painted to look like pound coins to save money. He was annoyed to see that as soon as the potatoes touched Mrs. Lovely's hands, they turned into real money. One of them turned into a jewel with a laughing face on it. "Shabber me whiskers," he growled, turning on his heel in disgust. "A pleasure to see you as always, Mr. Gum," beamed Mrs. Lovely as the old man stormed out with the little bag of lemon powder clutched between his elbows. "I do hope you come again soon." Mr. Gum hardly noticed the walk home, mainly because he took a taxi. He couldn't wait to get his plan into action. Very soon he was back in his smelly kitchen. He rubbed his hands together gleefully and danced a cruel jig, like a spiteful imp who'd snotted all over the presents on Christmas morning. He opened the little bag and sprinkled its contents over the rotten and poisoned cow hearts. Then he gave them a quick sniff. "Jibbers," he gasped, clutching his throat. "They smell of lemons and sunshine and friendship. I can hardly breathe." Holding it an arm's length, Mr. Gum took the plate of doom out into his very neat and tidy garden. He placed it right in the middle of the lawn where Jake was sure to see it. The day was very still. Not a single blade of grass was moving. Somewhere in the distance, a chicken barked. Mr. Gum settled back in his favourite broken chair and waited to see what would happen. Chapter 7. Friday O'Leary. So now we head back to Polly, who is just where we left her, having a good old cry outside the secret cottage. Who, though, is that old man watching her from the window? You've probably been going crazy from all the suspense, haven't you? Well, you can breathe a sigh of relief, because it's none other than Friday O'Leary, who is one of the heroes of this story. The next time somebody says to you, "I hate old men," all the old men are unpleasant and wicked, don't be too quick to agree with them. Take a minute to think about this tale. All old men are unpleasant and wicked. That's nonsense, you will say. No, it's not, says this somebody whose name is Anthony. Mr. Gum's an old man and he's a dreadful old shocker. That's true, Anthony, you say. And what about Billy William III, says Anthony smugly. He's as horrible as Brussels sprouts. Well, you've got me there, you say. But Anthony, you are forgetting about Friday O'Leary. He's an old man too, and he's an absolute winner. Oh, I am so stupid. I forgot about Friday O'Leary, says Anthony. I'm going away now to pay £200 to see a glass of water balanced on a horse's back. That is how stupid I am, and you will never be bothered by the likes of Anthony again. Just who was this Friday O'Leary character anyway? Not a lot was known about him, because it was a mysterious sort of fellow, but I will tell you what I know based on rumours, half truths and half downright fibs. Friday O'Leary was as old as the hills and as wise as the hills, but not quite as tall as the hills. His bald head was covered in thick curly hair, and he had a normal number of legs. He was the only person ever to have found a needle in a haystack, although to be fair, it was a very large needle in a tiny haystack. His favourite number was green, and his favourite colour was 26. He sometimes got his numbers and colours mixed up, and he owned the world's smallest collection of stamps. None at all. Oh, and one last thing. Occasionally, for reasons known only to himself, Friday O'Leary shouted, "The truth is a lemon meringue," at the end of his sentences. Anyway, earlier that day, Friday had been sitting in his front room playing the piano. He was playing a song he had written himself. And all about how he was playing a song he had written himself. He had also written a song, but he wasn't playing that at the moment. He had just come to the final lines when the telephone rang. Friday ran to get it, but he was too late because it wasn't ringing in his cottage. It was ringing in Ethel Frumpton's house, 100 miles away. It was her friend Mavis on the line. "Hello, Ethel," said Mavis. "How's things?" Back at the secret cottage, there came the sound of crying and sobbing and general unhappy little girl noises. Friday rushed to the window and uttered those famous suspenseful-filled words I mentioned before. "Well, well, well," he said. "What have we here? A little girl in trouble." Then he opened the front door and stepped outside. "Hello," he said to Polly. "Are you all right? The truth is a lemon meringue." "Who are you?" asked Polly. She was a little bit nervous because her mother had told her never to talk to strangers. Her mother was full of this sort of advice. Brush your teeth twice a day, wash your hands before meals, don't cut your legs off with a bread knife. But most of it was of never talk to strangers, which was blooming good advice, especially with a stranger of strange before her now. "They call me Mungo Bubbles," said the stranger, "but I don't know why, because my name is Friday O'Leary." And then Polly knew it was all right, because her mother had told her about this remarkable man one stormy night. This is what her mother had said. "Friday O'Leary is a mysterious old man who lives in a secret cottage near the woods. No one knows exactly where it is, not even the Prime Minister, but if you are in dire need, may find yourself there, and he will help you with your problems. Friday O'Leary, I mean, not the Prime Minister." Then Polly had a thought. What if it wasn't really Friday O'Leary? What if it was a bad man pretending to be him? She remembered something else her mother had told her. Friday O'Leary can juggle with 5 ping-pong balls in a banana, and he hardly ever drops them. So Polly asked the old man if he wouldn't mind juggling 5 ping-pong balls in a banana for her. Luckily, she had 5 ping-pong balls in a banana in her shirt pocket, so Friday juggled them, and he hardly ever dropped them. And then Polly was convinced. Suddenly, the woods looked friendly and welcoming, and Polly saw how beautiful all the nature was, and how she probably wasn't going to be eaten by a flower or anything. "Friday O'Leary," she cried, "I'm well glad to see you." "My name is Jammy Gammy Lammy Floopuff. I think I'll just call you Polly," said Friday. Chapter 8. Some Things Happen. Now I'll tell you what. Friday O'Leary wasn't the only character in the story with the mysterious house. Nobody knew where Jake the dog lived either. "I bet he lives on a farm and plays with all the other animals," said Jonathan Ripples, the fattest man in town, rubbing his chins. "Maybe he lives in the house of a rich man who feeds him bones and made of gold," said the little girl called Peter. "This is just a guess," said Martin Laundrette. But perhaps he lives on a farm where he plays with all the other animals." Suddenly, Jonathan Ripples pounced on Martin Laundrette and sat on him until he was wheezing for breath like a broken accordion. "That'll teach you not to steal people's ideas, you skinny rubbisher," said Jonathan Ripples. "Come on, Peter, let's go for an ice cream." In any case, Jake didn't live on a farm, and he didn't live in a rich man's house. Nobody knew where he lived except me, and I'm not telling you. "Okay, I'll tell you for £1. "Okay, 50p. "Okay, 10p. "Come on, 10p. It's not much." "Oh, go on." "Okay, you win. I'll tell you anyway. He lived in the woods up a horse chestnut tree. He had built a great big nest up there and filled it with old leaves which kept him warm at night. Someone had left an old radio lying in the woods, and Jake had found it one day and taken it up to his nest, even though it didn't work. He was just a dog, after all. While Polly was searching for Jake, that very dog had been having a grand old time. He larked around the cuckoos, gone cuckoo with the larks, and bought some tinfoil of a magpie for a couple of horse chestnuts. After lunch, he decided to go into town to play in a garden or two. He shimmied down the tree quicker than you can read the sentence and set off in a very happy mood. Off he went, strolling along in the sunshine with not a care in the world, barking and burping away and singing a song which went like this: "Bark, bark, 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 woof." Soon Jake came to the town. He passed old Granny's garden with its lovely soft lawn and pond full of friendly ducks. He passed the celebrated garden of the retired wrestler Marvellous Marvin, with its rockery in the shape of wrestling. He passed Beanie McLeany's garden, where everything rhymed and the flowers grew like towers. But there was only one garden Jake fancied romping on today, and that was Mr. Gum's. Once he went with his great furry legs. Soon he came to the High Street. Watching secretly from behind his greasy window, Billy William laughed to think of a nasty surprise that awaited the unsuspecting hound. "It's funty," he chuckled to himself as Jake walked down the road and out of sight. "I'll eat Jake came down to the spiky fence that surrounded Mr. Gum's dirty house. It might have kept other dogs out, but Jake was one of those magnificent beasts who knew not to fear another hesitation nor how to scramble eggs properly. He did a sort of bouncing run, and in no time at all he was all over it. Well, obviously, not in no time at all. Of course it took some time, but not much. He landed in the garden in a shower of dirt and flowers and barked his welcoming bark to let all of his garden friends know he had arrived. His welcoming bark went like this, bark, as opposed to his normal bark, which went like this, bark. The animals all recognised Jake's welcoming bark because it was so different from his normal one. Immediately, the moles popped up out of their mole holes, the squirrels popped up out of their squirrel holes, and the cats popped up out of their cat holes. In Mr. Gum's kitchen, the toast popped out of the toaster, but Mr. Gum saw it trying to escape and scoffed it up greedily. "What's going on?" he scowled, but then his eyes lit up horridly. "I bet it's him," he exclaimed, spitting toast everywhere. "I bet it's that flea-bag dog." Very carefully, Mr. Gum tiptoed over to the kitchen window and did secret spying with his unfriendly eyes. Outside, Jake was racing excitedly around the lawn, chasing his own tail. The caterpillars were so happy to see him that they immediately metamorphosed into butterflies. One of the caterpillars was so happy that it metamorphosed into a donkey. The moles squeaked and the butterflies roared with pleasure. The birds came sweeping out of trees, chirping like good uns, and the sun seemed to do magic tricks in the sky. Mr. Gum watched the whole scene unfold from behind the curtains, hating all joy that the world was having. "Come on, you meddler," he said under his bad breath. "Come on and eat them hearts." Then it happened. Jake suddenly stopped barking. His nose twitched as he sniffed the scent of lemon powder. Of course, the townsfolk were always putting out delicious treats for Jake, so he thought his luck was in. He bounded over to the plate of cow hearts in the middle of the lawn. The other animals froze in horror as the big dog opened his mouth. One of the moles let out a warning squeak, but he only got out as far as squeak. It was too late. Jake's doggy jaws had already closed around the heart. Chew, chew, chew. He chewed it up. Swallow, swallow, swallow. He swallowed it down. Go for another, go for another, go for another. He went for another heart. But before he could take another bite, he gave a sad woof and fell on his side, his big furry belly moving rapidly in and out. Suddenly, the sun was covered up by a dirty grey cloud of the size of Sweden. Behind the curtains, Mr. Gum was laughing like a robber. Chapter 9. Polly and Friday Ride into Town. Back at the cottage, Polly was telling Friday O'Leary about all the danger Jake was in. Friday listened carefully, saying things like, and yes, I see. Finally, Polly finished with her story and looked anxiously at her new friend. He was lost in thought, twirling an imaginary moustache which he thought made him look like a detective. Polly felt sure he was working on a brilliant plan. "Tell me, Polly," he said at last, "do you fancy a game of tennis?" "Tennis?" said Polly. "What about Jake?" Surprised exclamation. "I'd forgotten all about that," said Friday. There was no time to lose. With that, he disappeared into the cottage and slammed the front door shut. 5 minutes later, the door was flung open again, and there stood Friday, dressed as a tennis player. "Here," he said, handing Polly a racket. "You can serve first because you're the guest." "But Mr. O'Leary," as patiently as possible, "we've got to save the big dog Jake, like I told you millions of times just now." "Oh, yeah," said Friday. "Sorry, let's go." He threw down his tennis racket, jumped onto the motorbike, kick-started the engine and zoomed off like the devil himself, but a good devil, not an evil one. "Hey," shouted Polly, "aren't you forgetting something?" "Oops," said Friday, and returned to pick her up. Polly climbed into the sidecar and strapped on her helmet. "Hold on tight. The truth is a lemon meringue," shouted Friday, and away they went. It was a long ride into town. They passed hills and lakes and rivers and meadows and Scotland. "Oops," said Friday. "Wrong way." And off they belted in the opposite direction. "Hey, Polly," shouted Friday over the noise of the engine. "What did you mean earlier when you said that Jake had once saved your life?" "How do you know I said that?" said Polly. "There wasn't no one around when the words came out of my lips." "It's all in this book I'm reading," said Friday. pulling a copy of You're a Bad Man, Mr. Gum from his pocket. You mentioned it in Chapter 5. At that, Polly's face grew excitedly and her hair grew longer. Maybe it says what's going to happen to Big Jake in there, she said. Don't talk of what might be in the future, little miss, warned Friday. 'Tisn't wise, isn't wise. Oh, please, let's look in that book, said Polly, and she sounded so upset that Friday stopped the motorbike at once. Okay, he said, opening the book to the same page that you are reading right now. But it isn't wise. No sooner, he had said, isn't wise, than Polly read those very words on the page. As Polly read about herself, reading about herself, the strangest feeling came over her. It felt like driving into a swimming pool full of rice, in complete darkness. Only the swimming pool was inside a mirror, and the whole thing was a dream in someone's head. Well, it felt a bit like that. It's hard to describe. With shaking his hands, Friday turned to the last chapter, only to find the pages were completely blank. The future hasn't been written yet, said Friday, starting up the bike again. 'Tis not wise for us to know. 'Twasn't wise, said Polly. Hey, I wanted to say that, complained Friday, reviving the engine. Don't steal my lines. Anyway, how did Jake save your life? Oh, it was an unusual sort of thing, said Polly, as they zoomed off once more. He rescued me from a burning centipede. Eventually, Polly and Friday O'Leary reached the town. There was a roaring and a bumping down the high street when they were spotted by Billy William III. Knowing how Friday was a force for good, Billy William jumped out from his shop and began pegging filthy old cuts of meat in their direction. Ha ha! He laughed, as Friday swerved to avoid a cascade of grey hamburgers. This is just like butcher's darts. He picked up a bucket of tripe and sloshed it across the road. Take that, you force for good, he shouted wildly. Hold tight, Polly, yelled Friday, as the bike went skidding in the slippery mess. Tripe attack! Friday steered for his life, but it was no use. The wheels got all gooed up with tripe, and before you knew it, he and Polly were thrown onto the pavement. They lay there, helpless, as Billy William advanced with a snack of kidneys. Is this the end? Cried Friday. Whoa, it's me. At the moment, something amazing happened. A gobstopper, the size of a cannonball, rolled down the street. It was quickly followed by another one, even bigger than the first, then another. All of them were hurtling with deadly accuracy towards Billy William, and they were hurtling down none other than that wonderful seller of sweets, Mrs. Lovely. No! Shouted Billy William. In desperation, he threw a kidney at her, but it missed by miles and landed in a tree. But Mrs. Lovely didn't bat an eyelid. On she came down the high street, humming a pretty tune about wet waterfall and rolling the enormous, brightly coloured gobstoppers before her. Soon the street was filled with them. Billy William hopped and dodged and swore like a footballer, but there were too many and down he went. That woman's amazing, said Friday, his eyes shining with admiration and tripe. Come on, Friday, Jake needs us, said Polly, jumping back into the sidecar. Mrs. Lovely can sort this one out later. Friday jumped back on the bike, hit the gas, and off they vammed down the road, the battle still racing behind them. I made that happen, said Friday excitedly, as they gunned along. I magicked it so that Mrs. Lovely would appear at that just right moment and save us. Actually, he had done nothing of the sort. He wanted to keep Polly moral up after these terrible scenes. Also, there was a tiny boastful streak in him which he couldn't help, good as he was the rest of the time. The two of them rode into silence. Soon they came to the high white fence that surrounded Mr. Gum's garden. Chapter 10. Jake's Darkest Hour. Just like Jake, that fence caused Polly and Friday no trouble at all. They just farted over it like blackbirds. More meddlers, griped Mr. Gum, dodging the angry fairy, who was back with vengeance, and of course, a frying pan. Who needs it? The motorbike screeched to a halt in the front of the oak tree. Polly jumped out of the sidecar and ran up to Jake, who lay on the lawn surrounded by his loyal animal friends. The moles shook their heads sadly. A squirrel blew its nose on a butterfly. The cats looked close to tears, for Jake was the only dog they had ever loved. Polly gasped when she saw him. The one splendid beast looked as weak as a baby. His fur had lost its shine, and his eyes were rolled towards the heavens. He was mere of shadows, his former self, and his shadow was a mere of a shadow of his former self's shadow. "Don't die on us, Jake," she sobbed, throwing her arms around him. "You're too fat and good to die." Jake's only reply was a feeble little woof, which sounded like a door closing. "If it had been for that butcher, we could have reached him in time," sniffed Polly. "Time," said Friday mysteriously. "That is time, little miss. 'Tisn't wise to talk of what might have been and what might have not. 'Tisn't wise." Polly was beginning to think that Friday was a pretty rubbish hero, but she had other things to worry about. "What we gonna do?" she wailed. "Just you wait and everything will turn out." "Fine," said Friday, tapping his nose widely. Actually, he didn't have a clue what to do, but just then Mr. Gum raced up to the fairy at his heels. "It's no use, O'Leary," cried Mr. Gum, like the world's most evil seagull. "That dog'll never bother no one again." "We can still save him," said Polly fiercely. "I don't think so, horrible little girl," said Mr. Gum. "Look at this." He pointed to his own shirt, on which was written "Champion Expert Dog Poisoner." "That doesn't mean nothing," said Polly. "You just writ them words on yourself in ketchup." That shut Mr. Gum up for a minute, because it was true. Said Friday, bending down to investigate Jake, even though he secretly bit scared of dogs. Suddenly he stood up, his imaginary detective moustache back in all his glory. "Tell me, Gummy, me boy," said Friday, twirling his invisible moustache cunningly, "what is the one thing that can cure the big whopper of a dog here?" "Why, you know as well as I do, you crazy turkey," chuckled Mr. Gum. "The only thing what can bring a dog back from the brink is the tears of a man reunited with its long-lost brother, and that's not going to happen now, is it?" Said Friday grandly, wagging a little finger like he imagined a detective would. "The tears of a man reunited with its long-lost brother, you say? Well, guess what, Mr. Gum? You are my long-lost brother, and I have a picture of us together when we were small, and when you grew older you went over to the dark side and became a bad man and forgot all about me, your brother, who was a force of good, and now look at what you've been reduced to, poisoning a happy bouncer of a dog, just to avoid a whacking from a fairy like the cowardly, bitter old thing you have become. And now that I tell you this amazing information, something inside you is bursting forth, and you are filled with loving compassion and dinner, and you cannot help but shed tears all over this blimmin' dog, and wake up from its terrible sleep. The truth is a lemon meringue." Triumphantly, Friday handed Mr. Gum a battered photograph from the old days. It showed Friday when he was but a lad, standing next to another boy. "That other boy is you," said Friday. "Now bring on those tears." The animals gasped, and Polly clapped her hands together in delight. Mr. Gum peered closely at the photograph. "Nah, that ain't me," he said. "We ain't long-lost brothers at all, you weirdo." "Oh," said Friday. He turned to Polly miserably, his imaginary moustache drooping like an imaginary weeping willow. "Well, little miss," he said softly, "I did my best." Suddenly it was all very quiet, like the sad bit of story. No bird sang at that unhappy hour. No one stirred for once. Even the angry fairy was silent. The only sound was Jake breathing in and out, weaker each time. "Goodbye, Jake," sniffed Polly, burying her head in the fur. "You were a good old boy, you was." Just then someone tapped her on the shoulder. She looked up to see a little boy she had never seen before. Somehow, though, Polly felt as if she'd known him her whole life. A feeling of great peace and warmth spread through her. "And it's that nightmare from the sweet shop," Mr. Gum exclaimed. "How did he get here?" Turn again, Mr. Gum," said the boy with his beautiful, honest face. Mr. Gum backed away, his hands raised as if to ward off a ghost. "I don't like it one bit," he said in a quavering voice, appearing out of nowhere and taking a turning again. "I don't like it." "I know you can be a good again," said the boy, offering him another fruit chew. That was enough for Mr. Gum. He gave a terrified yelp, clambered over the fence, and scooted off down the road. That boy's words still was ringing in his ears. The little boy turned back to Polly. "Child," he said, even though he was no older than she, "listen carefully. You must zip into Mr. Gum's house and look inside the sailor's chest, which stands in the front hall. It is full of magic chocolate with fantastic powers," he whispered. "Do not tarry, but bring me as much as you can." Polly didn't wait to hear any more, but zipped into the house. There in the hallway stood the chest. It was a beautiful thing in that lovely place, and it seemed to shine with hope and fun and furniture polish. She threw the lid open, looked inside, and found nothing at all. The chest was completely empty. Chapter 11. How it all turned out. It had been too long. All the chocolate had turned to dust or been eaten by sailors. Any other girl would have given up right then and shrunk to her knees in despair on Mr. Gum's yuck carpet. But Polly wasn't any other girl. She was Polly. So, into the dark depths of the chest she climbed. It was much larger than it looked from the outside, and it smelt of old sea adventures and underwater business. She scrabbled around on the wooden floor, lost in the darkness, crying, hardly ever remembering what she was looking for anymore. She had a horrible feeling she was tarrying, even though she didn't really know what it meant. Well, I don't care, she sobbed. I'll tarry forever, if that's what it takes to save Big Jake. And what's more, just then, Polly's hand closed on something small, hidden at the very back. Slowly, her heart pumping, like one of those things you use to blow up balloons, she brought it into the light. On her palm lay a single chocolate in the shape of a dolphin, the very last piece of Nathaniel Surname's treasure from that Tuesday, long ago. Just once it seemed to wink at her, but it could have been a trick of the light rather than a trick of confectionery. You're our last hope, Chocolate, said Polly, flabbing out of his chest as fast as she could. I just hope you're enough to save Big Jake. You have done well, child, said the little boy when she returned. Now let us see if the legends are true. Tremblingly, Polly held Jake's jaw open and tenderly stuffed the chocolate down his gob. Just as soon as it went in his tongue, it turned down to a real dolphin, all silvery blue, and went sliding down his throat doing whistling noises. For a moment nothing happened. Then Jake's eyes flickered open and he uttered a little bark. It felt good, so he did another one, a little bit louder and stronger than the first. With that second bark the day was saved and the bad stuff was at an end. The angry fairy disappeared in a puff of blue smoke that smelt like bacon and eggs, and the sun came out and started doing its magic tricks again. Even better ones than before, with real cards this time. The moles bounced up and down with glee, and the butterflies punched their little fists into the air in triumph. Jake got up and did a victory lap around the garden to show he was back for good. Then he did a victory lick of Polly's face with his big, pink doggy tongue, until she was giggling like a werewolf. You are no ordinary lad, said Friday, turning to the boy. Who are you really? I am the spirit of the rainbow, answered the boy, and it's my job to make the world glow with happy colours, so that we can all live peacefully together. Spirit, yelled a woman's voice from the next door. Your tea's ready. Sorry, gotta go or my mum will kill me, said the spirit of the rainbow, and off he ran for his tea. Well, I'll tell you what, the rest of the day was brilliant. Friday and Polly marched into town on Jake's broad back, and all of the animals danced capers about them with a squirrel puked up from all the excitement, and everyone laughed. Friday played a flute up one nostril and a trumpet up the other, and all the good people of Lamont Bibber came out and cheered and waved flags and ate feasts. Jonathan Ripples ate an entire feast by himself and spent most of the day in bed. And another marched the joyful procession, getting bigger all the while and heading towards Mrs. Lovely's wonderful land of sweets. But as they were crossing the town square, Mrs. Lovely herself ran up to greet the heroes. Apart from a chicken liver hanging from one of the arms, the courageous woman was fully recovered from the war against Billy William III. When he saw Mrs. Lovely, Friday's eyes went all shiny with admiration once again, and feeling swept over him like a rocket ship. He got down on one knee in the middle of the town square, then he got down onto 2 knees, then he got down on 3 knees, which hardly anyone else in the world can do. Mrs. Lovely, said Friday through a microphone so everyone could hear, you are the best. Do you fancy getting married? The crowd held its breath. A mole did a dramatic drum roll with a drum and a bread roll. All right, said Mrs. Lovely. I wasn't going to do anything else this weekend anyway. The whole town erupted with the biggest cheer yet. The butterflies rained down like confetti, and Jake did a massive happy bark, as if he understood exactly what was going on. Actually, he was barking at a twig he'd just noticed. But there you go, he was only a dog after all. Well, that's what, then, said Friday. Let's get in on the feasting action. But Polly had a thought. Where's that old Mr. Gum got to? She said. He's probably off getting drunk with Billy William, guessed Friday, and he was right. That's exactly where those two were up to, hating the world and falling over from the beer. But do you think he'll be back? Said Polly, Friday looking mysteriously. Who can say what this time, little miss, he said. 'Tisn't wise, and Mrs. Lovely, and Friday didn't even mind that she had stolen his line, because he was crazy in love and there was marrying to be done. And so life went on in the peaceful town of Lamonic Bibber, and everyone got on with their business. Friday married Mrs. Lovely, and they invited Polly over for Sunday roasts, and occasionally Friday did a few Sunday boasts, because of that tiny boastful streak in him, good as he was the rest of the time. But no one minded, and Mr. Gum and Billy William weren't seen for quite a while, and Martin Laundrette apologised to Jonathan Ripples, and Jake the dog played happily in gardens all summer long, and nothing much ever happened, and the sun went down over the mountains. The end.